My name is Dorothy Wilson and I just turned 67 last month. After 42 years of marriage, my husband Thomas passed away from cancer 6 weeks ago. Today, I sat in our family home while our lawyer prepared for the inheritance meeting. My daughter Laura looked at me with cool eyes. "This is a family matter, Mom. We'll let you know later." My son Michael nodded in agreement. They had no idea I had the updated will in my purse. If you're watching this story, let me know where you're viewing from in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe to hear how I handled being excluded from my own husband's will reading. Thomas and I met in 1975 at a community college where we were both taking night classes. I was working as a secretary during the day, and he was apprenticing at a construction company. We married in 1978 in a simple ceremony at my parents' backyard. Neither of us came from money, but we shared big dreams and a willingness to work hard for them. Our first home was a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. The rent was cheap and we saved every penny we could. Thomas would work his regular job during the day, then take on small repair projects in the evenings and weekends. I continued my secretarial work but also learned bookkeeping through another night class. We were young, in love, and determined to build something meaningful together. In 1981, Thomas took the biggest risk of our lives. With our modest savings and a small loan from my father, he started Wilson Construction. It was just him, a used pickup truck, and a collection of tools at first. I handled all the paperwork, billing, and scheduling from our kitchen table, while still working my day job. Those early years were exhausting but exhilarating. We were building not just a business but our future. The 1980s brought steady growth despite economic ups and downs. Thomas hired his first employees, and by 1985, I was able to quit my secretarial job to work full-time for our company. We moved operations from our apartment to a small office with a workshop attached. Thomas had a natural talent for construction and an honest way with clients that earned their trust. I made sure the books balanced and no detail was overlooked. We were partners in every sense of the word. Our daughter Laura was born in 1983. From the beginning, she was strong-willed and determined. As our business grew more successful, I noticed how quickly she became accustomed to the nicer things we could afford. By high school, she was obsessed with appearances and social status. When college applications came around, she refused to consider state schools, insisting on an expensive private university. Thomas wanted to make her happy, so we paid the tuition, though it meant delaying expansion plans for the business. Laura married Richard Brighton when she was 26. His family had old money and social connections that Laura coveted. The wedding was extravagant, costing nearly twice what we had budgeted. Richard worked in investment banking but seemed to coast on his family name rather than work ethic. They bought a house in the most expensive neighborhood in town, though I suspected they were stretched thin financially. Laura was always asking for loans that were never repaid. Our son Michael came along in 1986, 3 years after Laura. He was an easier child in many ways, more laid back and content. But as he grew, I noticed how easily influenced he was by his sister. When Laura got a new car for her 16th birthday, Michael expected the same. When she chose an expensive college, he followed suit. After graduation, Thomas offered him a position in the family business, hoping he would eventually take over. Michael accepted but never showed the passion or commitment his father had hoped for. He did the minimum required and expected maximum compensation. 2 years ago, Michael went through a bitter divorce that drained him financially. His ex-wife Jenny received a generous settlement, and suddenly Michael became much more interested in the family business finances. He began asking questions about Thomas's retirement plans and the company valuation that he had never bothered with before. Throughout the years, my role in Wilson Construction remained vital. I managed client relations, handled all financial aspects, and kept the office running smoothly. Thomas was the face of the company, but we both knew I was its backbone. Our employees respected us equally, and many had been with us for decades. We built the business on relationships and quality work, growing it into a regional company with 40 employees and an excellent reputation. 18 months ago, Thomas went in for a routine physical that led to a series of tests and eventually a devastating diagnosis: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 12 to 18 months. We kept the severity private at first, telling the children only that he was ill but undergoing treatment. Thomas wanted to put his affairs in order without causing immediate panic. The next 6 months were filled with treatments that offered hope, but delivered mostly suffering. Thomas faced it all with the same quiet strength he had shown throughout our marriage. I went to every appointment, managed his medications, and continued running the company in his absence. We hired a management consultant to help prepare for an eventual transition, though we weren't sure what form that would take yet. As Thomas's condition worsened and we shared more details with our children, I noticed a troubling shift in their behavior. Their visits became more frequent, which should have been comforting, but they always steered conversations toward business matters, inheritance questions, and property concerns. Laura would ask about investment accounts while barely inquiring about her father's comfort or treatment progress. Michael began taking a sudden interest in the company books, asking to help with financial matters I had managed competently for 40 years. One evening, after the children had left following another visit filled with thinly veiled questions about assets, Thomas took my hand and said something I'll never forget. I'm more worried about what my death will do to them than what this cancer is doing to me. I knew exactly what he meant, and it broke my heart. The children we had raised, loved, and sacrificed for were revealing a side of themselves that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, a day with gentle sunshine that seemed at odds with the heaviness in my heart. Thomas would have appreciated the good weather. He always said rainy funerals were too on the nose. That small thought almost made me smile as I sat in the front row of the church we had attended for 30 years. Laura took charge of the arrangements immediately after Thomas passed, barely consulting me about any details. When I suggested a simple service aligned with Thomas's unpretentious nature, she dismissed the idea. Dad was an important business leader in this community, she insisted. We need to honor that properly. What she meant became clear when I saw the mahogany casket with gold fixtures that cost 3 times what Thomas and I had specified in our funeral planning documents. Michael stood by silently as Laura overrode my objections. Mom, Laura knows about these things. Let's just defer to her judgment during this difficult time. The reception afterward was held at our home. Women from the church brought food, and neighbors stopped by with condolences. I moved through the afternoon in a fog, accepting hugs and kind words while feeling increasingly isolated in my own home. Laura kept pulling people aside for private conversations, while Michael stationed himself near Thomas's home office, intercepting anyone who wandered in that direction. That evening, after most guests had left, Laura suggested we have a family dinner to support each other. She ordered expensive takeout instead of accepting the homemade casseroles filling our refrigerator. Before I had finished my first bite, she placed a folder on the table. Mom, we should discuss the estate matters sooner rather than later. There are tax implications we need to address promptly. I stared at her, my fork suspended midair. My husband of 42 years had been buried hours ago, and she was discussing tax implications. Before I could respond, Michael pulled out his tablet. I've made a preliminary spreadsheet of what we think the estate includes, he said, turning the screen toward me. There were columns for real estate, business assets, investments, and personal property, with estimated values next to each. The total at the bottom was highlighted in bold. How could you possibly know these figures? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad mentioned things over the years, Laura said dismissively, and some of it is public record. We're just trying to be prepared. The next troubling incident came 3 days later when Laura and Richard stopped by unannounced. While Laura kept me occupied with questions about photo albums for a memorial project, I noticed Richard wandering through the house, studying the walls and ceilings with unusual interest. The crown molding in here is dated, I overheard him telling Laura in the living room. But the bones are good. A full renovation could increase the value by 30% easily. They didn't realize I was standing in the hallway. When I entered the room, they quickly changed the subject. Similar surprise visits followed from both children. Laura would bring coffee and pastries, then ask to look through family photos or memorabilia, using these activities as excuses to inspect the house. I noticed her taking pictures of artwork and antiques with her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. Michael began offering to organize Thomas's belongings, particularly focused on his home office and files. These fishing trophies are so dusty, Laura commented one day, picking up a shelf of modest awards Thomas had won at local tournaments. We should probably donate them. They're cluttering up the space. Those aren't clutter, I replied firmly. They're your father's memories, and they're staying right where they are. She rolled her eyes as if I were being sentimental and impractical. This furniture is so outdated, Mom. When you're ready to downsize, you'll thank me for helping you let go of some of these things. The word downsize caught my attention. It was the first direct reference to the future they were apparently planning for me. One afternoon about 2 weeks after the funeral, I returned from grocery shopping to find the door to Thomas's office slightly ajar. I always kept it closed, preserving his space as he had left it. Inside, I found evidence that someone had been searching through his files. Cabinet drawers were partially open, folders were out of order, and his desk chair was pulled out at an angle. More disturbing was the computer. Thomas had a separate laptop for personal matters, and when I checked the browsing history, I found recent searches for our bank accounts, investment portfolios, and property records. Someone had been looking up the value of our home and business using Thomas's computer. That evening, I called both children to confront them about the invasion of privacy. Laura immediately went on the offensive. Mom, we're just trying to help you organize Dad's affairs. You can't possibly want to handle all this yourself at a time like this. I've been handling our finances for 40 years, I reminded her. That was different, Michael chimed in. Dad was there to make the big decisions. You shouldn't worry about these complex matters now. The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. In their minds, I had been downgraded from capable business partner to helpless widow overnight. The next day, I was in the garden when I overheard a phone conversation between Laura and Michael. My daughter was on our back patio, not realizing I was just on the other side of the hedge. The Sunrise Retirement Village has openings, she was saying. It's small but decent, and the monthly fee is reasonable. A pause as Michael responded. I know she won't want to go, but once the house sells, she'll need somewhere. We can present it as the practical option. Richard thinks we can list the house by next month if we move quickly. I remained frozen behind the hedge, dirt still clinging to my gardening gloves. They were planning my future without the slightest consideration for my wishes or input. The home Thomas and I had built together, filled with 40 years of memories, was just a real estate opportunity to them. The final confirmation of their intentions came when Laura called to inform me that she had scheduled a meeting with Jenkins, our family attorney, to discuss the estate. It's set for Friday at 10, she said. Michael and I have already taken the day off work. Shouldn't I have been consulted about this meeting? I asked. Oh, I figured you're free most days now, she replied casually. And Jenkins had limited availability. It's important we get this process started. The night before the meeting, Laura called again with what she framed as helpful advice. Mom, these legal meetings can be really boring and stressful, she said. Lots of technical terms and paperwork. Michael and I are happy to handle the details and just give you the summary afterward. I think I can manage to understand my husband's will, I replied, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. Of course you can, she said with the same tone she'd use for a child. I just don't want you to feel overwhelmed. Dad would want us to take care of these things for you. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calm replacing the hurt and anger that had been building. Thomas had seen this coming long before I had been willing to admit it. Now I understood why he had taken certain precautions. Tomorrow would reveal just how well he had prepared for this moment. I woke early on Friday morning after a restless night. Though part of me wanted to stay in bed and avoid the confrontation ahead, I knew Thomas would expect more from me. He had always admired my strength, even when I didn't recognize it in myself. Despite my anxiety, I went through my normal morning routine, finding comfort in the familiar. I decided to bake Thomas's favorite cinnamon rolls, a recipe his mother had passed down to me. The children had always loved them, and there was something defiant in maintaining this tradition on today of all days. The house filled with the sweet, spicy aroma that had marked so many family Sundays and holidays. For my outfit, I chose a navy blue dress Thomas had always loved. You look like you could run a small country in that dress, he used to joke. I needed that feeling of authority today, Before heading downstairs, I opened my jewelry box and took out Thomas's wedding ring, which I had placed on a simple chain after the funeral. I slipped it into my purse alongside the envelope I had prepared. The weight of it against my hip would remind me of what I was fighting for. Attorney Jenkins arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. He had handled our legal matters for nearly 30 years, watching our children grow up and our business expand. He seemed uncomfortable when I greeted him at the door, barely meeting my eyes. "Dorothy, my deepest condolences again," he said, clutching his briefcase tightly. Thomas was a fine man. Before I could respond, Laura appeared in the foyer, inserting herself between us. "Jenkins, thank you for coming," she said, taking his arm. "We've set up in Dad's office. Michael's already there with the documents you requested." She guided him toward the back of the house, leaving me to follow behind like an afterthought in my own home. As we entered Thomas's office, I noticed how Laura had rearranged things. The photos of Thomas and me from our early business days were no longer on the desk, replaced by a stack of folders and legal pads. Laura settled into Thomas's leather chair behind the desk, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Michael sat to her right, calculator and notepad at the ready. Jenkins took the chair across from them, leaving me the small seat in the corner, the one usually reserved for clients or delivery people needing signatures. "Shall we begin?" Laura said, nodding to Jenkins. The attorney cleared his throat and opened his briefcase. "Yes, well, as you know, we're here to discuss the administration of Thomas Wilson's estate. I have the will that was executed in 2018, which is the most recent document on file with my office." I noticed the specific wording. "On file with my office." Jenkins was being carefully precise, as attorneys tend to be. "Before we review the specific provisions," Jenkins continued, "I should explain the general process of probate and what you can expect in terms of timeline and tax obligations." As he launched into his explanation, I leaned forward and asked, "Has the business valuation been updated? Thomas mentioned wanting a new assessment last year." Laura shot me an annoyed look. "Mom, let's let Jenkins cover the basics first. We can get to specific questions later." Jenkins looked uncomfortable but continued his overview. He was explaining executor responsibilities when Laura suddenly raised her hand to interrupt him. "Actually, Jenkins, before we continue any further." She turned to look at me with a practiced sympathetic expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, Michael and I have discussed this, and we think it might be best if you let us handle this part alone. This is a family matter, and these details might be upsetting for you. We'll let you know all the important points later." Michael nodded in agreement, but kept his eyes fixed on his notepad. Jenkins shifted in his seat but said nothing, trapped between professional obligation and social discomfort. I felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. My own daughter was dismissing me from a meeting about my husband's estate, in my own home, treating me as if I were an inconvenient child rather than Thomas's wife and partner of over 4 decades. For a moment, I considered objecting, reminding them all of who I was and what Thomas and I had built together. But a quiet voice in my head, one that sounded remarkably like Thomas, whispered, "Let them show their true colors. Sometimes people need enough rope to hang themselves." So I rose from my chair, smoothed my navy dress and said simply, "I see." As I walked toward the door, I could feel Laura's relief and Michael's guilt, though neither spoke. Jenkins busied himself with his papers, clearly grateful not to have to take sides. I closed the door behind me but didn't walk away. In the hallway, I paused beside a photo of Thomas and me at the groundbreaking of our first major commercial project. His arm was around my waist, both of us holding ceremonial shovels and beaming with pride. We had been through so much together, overcome so many obstacles. This latest challenge would be faced without him physically present, but I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder, steadying me. I moved closer to the door, not bothering to disguise my footsteps. If they cared enough to check whether I was eavesdropping, let them find me doing exactly that. But as I expected, they were too preoccupied with their plans to notice. "Thank God," I heard Laura say, her voice instantly transforming from the sympathetic tone she had used with me to something harder and more businesslike. "Now we can speak frankly. Let's start with the house," she continued. "I've already spoken with a realtor friend of Richard's. Once we clear probate, we should list it immediately. The market is strong right now. What about Mom? Michael asked, his voice quieter. She's going to expect to stay here. That's not practical, Laura dismissed. This place is way too big for her, and the maintenance costs alone would eat through her resources. The retirement community I found is perfectly adequate. I agree she can't manage alone, Jenkins interjected. But the house is likely to be part of her inheritance. She would need to consent to any sale. She'll be reasonable once we explain the financial realities, Laura said confidently. Mom has never been good with money. Dad made all the important financial decisions. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, the blatant lie physically jarring me. I had managed our household and business finances for our entire marriage. What about the business? Jenkins asked. Liquidation makes the most sense, Laura replied. Neither of us wants to run a construction company, and the assets are the real value anyway. The equipment, contracts, and land holdings should fetch a good price if we move quickly. What about the employees? Jenkins asked. Many have been with the company for decades. That's business, Laura said dismissively. They'll find other jobs. Our responsibility is to maximize the estate value. Dad would hate that, Michael said softly, showing the first sign of understanding what their father had stood for. Dad's not here, Laura snapped. And we need to be practical. Richard says the business real estate alone could be worth millions if rezoned for mixed-use development. I'd heard enough. The envelope in my purse felt heavier now, weighted with purpose rather than just paper. I took out my phone and sent a text message to a number I had programmed earlier that week. They've shown their hand. Please come now. Then I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and waited for the right moment. Thomas had always said timing was everything, whether in business deals or family matters. This would be the most important timing of my life. As I waited in the kitchen, my mind traveled back to a day almost exactly 1 year earlier. Thomas and I had just returned from his oncologist appointment, where he had received the terminal diagnosis privately before sharing it with me in the car. The cancer had spread despite treatments, and his remaining time was now measured in months rather than years. We sat in our backyard that evening, watching the sunset in a silence that held more understanding than words could express. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice soft but resolved. I'm worried about the kids. I took his hand, its strength diminished but still familiar. They'll be devastated, but they're adults. They'll find their way through the grief. He shook his head slightly. That's not what I mean. I'm worried about who they've become, the values they seem to live by. It was a conversation we had skirted around for years, acknowledging our children's flaws in small comments, but never confronting the larger truth. Somewhere along the way, despite our best efforts, Laura and Michael had developed a sense of entitlement and materialism that contradicted everything Thomas and I believed in. We gave them too much, Thomas continued. Tried to give them the advantages we didn't have, but instead, he trailed off, looking at the garden he had lovingly tended for decades. We did our best, I said, the defense feeling hollow even to my own ears. But was our best good enough? Laura treats money like water, always running through her fingers. Michael follows her lead without thinking. Neither of them understands what it took to build what we have. A week later, my concerns about our children's character were confirmed in the most painful way. Thomas had dozed off in his study, the door slightly ajar, when Laura and Richard arrived unexpectedly. Thinking Thomas was napping upstairs, they spoke freely in the living room while I was in the kitchen. Once the business assets are liquidated, you'll have your share to clear those credit card debts, Richard was saying. My father knows a commercial developer who would snap up that land the warehouse sits on. And Michael will go along with whatever I suggest, Laura replied. He always does. The question is what to do about Mom. Your father's will probably leaves her well provided for, Richard said. Yes, but she has no idea how to manage that kind of money. She's been a glorified secretary her whole life. Dad made the real business decisions. I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. The dismissal of my role in building our company from nothing was so casual, so complete. We'll need to guide her financial decisions, Laura continued. Convince her to sell the house right away. At her age, she should be in a retirement community anyway. Something modest but nice enough that we don't have to feel guilty. I didn't hear Richard's response because I was too focused on controlling my breathing, on not storming into the room and confronting my daughter's callous planning. When I finally composed myself, they had moved on to discussing which of Thomas's personal items might be valuable. That evening, I shared the conversation with Thomas. His face registered pain but not surprise. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said finally. "I need to make some changes to protect you and what we've built. It's not just about the money, it's about making sure our life's work isn't dismantled the moment I'm gone." The next day, Thomas asked me to contact attorney James Maxwell, a respected estate lawyer who had handled matters for several of our business associates. He specifically requested someone unknown to our children. Maxwell came to our home the following week while Laura and Michael were at work. Thomas was direct about his concerns and intentions. "I want to update my will to reflect some new decisions," he told Maxwell. "My previous will, with Jenkins, was a standard arrangement splitting assets between my wife and children. I need something more specific now." For the next 2 hours, Thomas outlined his revised wishes, occasionally asking my input, but largely working from plans he had clearly been considering for some time. Maxwell took detailed notes, asking clarifying questions, and offering legal alternatives when needed. The new will provisions were both simple and profound. The family home and all personal property would remain solely mine. The business would be sold, but with specific conditions. 50% of the proceeds would come to me directly, while 30% would establish the Thomas and Dorothy Wilson Foundation, a charitable organization focused on construction training programs for disadvantaged youth. Laura and Michael would each receive 10% of the business proceeds immediately upon sale. An additional 15% each would be held in trust, to be distributed only if they actively participated in the foundation's work for at least 3 years. "I want them to experience giving rather than just taking," Thomas explained. "To understand that our success was always meant to serve a purpose beyond personal enrichment." There were additional details. College funds for the grandchildren protected from their parents' access, specific personal items designated for friends and loyal employees, and a small fund to support the local fishing club Thomas had enjoyed for years. "Are you certain about these changes?" Maxwell asked. "They represent a significant departure from your previous arrangements." Thomas looked at me, then back to Maxwell. "I've built my life on 2 principles: taking care of my family and giving honest value for honest pay. These changes honor both. My children are adults who need to find their own way, not wait for an inheritance to solve their self-created problems. And Dorothy has been my partner in everything. She deserves security and respect." Maxwell nodded. "And you understand that these changes may cause conflict within the family?" Thomas smiled sadly. "The conflict already exists. My death will just bring it to the surface. Better to address it directly than pretend it isn't there." When the new will was finalized 2 weeks later, Maxwell suggested a strategic approach for its revelation. "Let's keep the original will with Jenkins for now," he advised. "The children will expect that. But Mrs. Wilson should have a copy of the new will, and we'll file the original with the court immediately after your passing, Mr. Wilson. There will likely be an initial meeting with Jenkins where the old will is discussed, creating an opportunity for the new will to be introduced." Thomas agreed with the approach. "It's not about creating drama," he told me later. "It's about making sure the truth can't be manipulated or hidden." As Thomas's condition worsened in his final months, we had many conversations about the decisions he had made. Sometimes he questioned whether he was being too harsh, wondering if grief might transform our children's perspectives without the lesson he had designed. "You're not punishing them," I reassured him during one such moment of doubt. "You're asking them to be their best selves. That's what parents are supposed to do, even when it's difficult." In his final week, when morphine made most communication difficult, Thomas had a moment of clarity one evening. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "Stand firm. No matter how they push or what they say. Promise me." "I promise," I told him, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The 6 weeks since his death had tested that promise repeatedly. Every manipulative comment, Every dismissive gesture from my children had tempted me to reveal what I knew before the planned moment. But I had kept my word, allowing their true intentions to reveal themselves fully, just as Thomas had anticipated. Now, sitting in my kitchen while they plotted in his office, I knew the time had come to honor not just my promise to Thomas but everything we had built together. The doorbell rang right on time. Attorney Maxwell had arrived. I opened the front door to find James Maxwell standing on the porch, briefcase in hand. Though we had only met a handful of times, his calm presence was reassuring. He had the composed manner of someone accustomed to navigating emotional family situations. "Mrs. Wilson." He greeted me with a respectful nod. "I came as soon as I received your message. Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, gesturing him inside. "They're in Thomas's office with Attorney Jenkins. From what I overheard, they're planning to sell everything as quickly as possible." Maxwell's expression remained neutral, but I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. Just as Mr. Wilson anticipated. "Shall we proceed?" We walked down the hallway, my heartbeat quickening with each step. Outside Thomas's office door, I paused and took a deep breath. Maxwell waited patiently, allowing me this moment to gather my courage. Without knocking, I pushed the door open. The conversation inside ceased immediately. Laura, Michael, and Jenkins looked up in unified surprise, though their expressions quickly diverged. Jenkins appeared uncomfortable, Michael slightly guilty, but Laura's face showed only irritation at the interruption. "Mom," she said with forced patience, "we're in the middle of something important here." I stepped fully into the room, straightening my posture just as Thomas would have done before a critical business negotiation. "I believe there's something you should know before you continue." I walked to the head of the table, where Thomas would have sat, and took the chair deliberately. From my purse, I removed the sealed envelope Maxwell had provided me after Thomas's passing. I placed it in the center of the desk, my hand resting on it for a moment. "Thomas made some changes you should be aware of," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Laura's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion. "What are you talking about? What changes?" Jenkins looked equally puzzled, glancing between me and the envelope with professional concern. "A new will," I stated simply, "executed last year." Laura's reaction was immediate and dismissive. "That's impossible. Dad would have told us. This must be some mistake or misunderstanding." She reached for the envelope, but I moved it beyond her grasp. "It's not a mistake," I replied. "Thomas was very deliberate in his planning. Even if there is another document," Laura continued, her voice taking on the condescending tone she often used with me lately, "it would need to be properly executed and witnessed to be valid. Dad was very ill last year. His judgment was compromised." As if on cue, the office door opened again and Maxwell stepped in. "Mrs. Wilson, you left the door open. May I join you?" he asked formally, though we had planned this entrance. "Please do," I replied. "Everyone, this is Attorney James Maxwell. Thomas engaged his services last year for some important legal matters." Jenkins stood halfway from his chair, recognition dawning on his face. "Maxwell? From Brewster and Maxwell downtown." "The same," Maxwell confirmed, stepping forward to shake Jenkins' hand. "I believe we've crossed paths at the Bar Association meetings." Laura's face had begun to flush. "I don't understand what's happening here. Who is this person, and why would Dad consult another attorney without telling us?" Maxwell placed his briefcase on the table and extracted a leather portfolio. "I can answer that, Ms. Wilson. Your father retained me specifically because he wanted independent counsel for certain aspects of his estate planning. He was quite clear about his reasons. He removed several documents and placed them beside my envelope. This is the last will and testament of Thomas Wilson, executed on October 17th of last year, witnessed by myself and 2 notaries, with your father's physician present to confirm his sound mental state. I have filed the original with the probate court as instructed, but this certified copy is for family reference." Laura snatched the document before I could stop her, her eyes scanning the pages rapidly. Her expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, and then to anger. "This can't be legal," she declared, dropping the papers as if they had burned her fingers. Dad would never do this. He must have been coerced or confused. We'll contest it immediately. Maxwell remained unruffled. You're welcome to pursue that course, Ms. Wilson, but I should inform you that your father anticipated such a reaction. We took extraordinary measures to document his mental competence, including videotape statements explaining his reasoning for each provision. The court generally respects clear testamentary intent when it's so thoroughly established. Michael, who had been silent until now, picked up the discarded will and began reading more carefully than his sister had. His face paled as he absorbed the details. A foundation? He asked quietly. 30% to a foundation? The Thomas and Dorothy Wilson Foundation, Maxwell confirmed, focused on construction training for disadvantaged youth. Your father was quite passionate about the concept. And only 10% to each of us? Laura's voice had risen an octave. With the rest tied to working for this foundation? This is ridiculous. Dad built that business for us, for his family. Actually, I interjected, finding strength in the familiar territory of our company's history. Thomas built that business with me, for our community and our employees. The family benefits were always secondary to creating something worthwhile. Jenkins, who had been reading over Michael's shoulder, cleared his throat. These provisions appear to be in proper legal form, he acknowledged reluctantly. If this will was properly executed and filed as Mr. Maxwell indicates, it would indeed supersede the document I have. Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. This is your doing, she accused, pointing at me. You manipulated Dad when he was weak and dying. This will never stand up in court, and I'll make sure everyone knows how you took advantage of him. The accusation stung, but Thomas had prepared me for this reaction too. Your father made these decisions with a clear mind and heart, Laura. He saw how you and Michael viewed his legacy as nothing but a payday. Today has only confirmed his concerns. We're your children. Laura nearly shouted. You're choosing strangers over your own family. No, I corrected her gently. I'm honoring your father's wishes and the values we built our lives around. Values we clearly failed to pass on to you. Laura grabbed her designer purse and moved toward the door. This isn't over. I'll be contacting our own attorney immediately. Richard's family has connections you can't imagine. You do what you feel is necessary, I replied, maintaining the calm Thomas would have expected. She stormed out, the front door slamming moments later. Richard, who had been waiting in his car outside, would soon hear a version of events that painted me as the villain. I was prepared for that too. Michael remained seated, still holding the will, his eyes fixed on some middle distance as he processed the implications. 10% is still a substantial amount, Jenkins noted, apparently trying to find something positive to say. The business valuation last year put it at nearly $7 million. And the foundation work wouldn't be difficult, Maxwell added. The terms require only 20 hours per week for 3 years to receive the additional 15%. Many find such work quite rewarding. Michael finally looked up at me. Can I have some time to think about this? To talk to you about it later. It was the first reasonable response either of my children had offered since Thomas's diagnosis, and it gave me a glimmer of hope. Of course, I said. I'm not going anywhere. After some discussion of next steps and legalities, both attorneys prepared to leave. Jenkins offered awkward condolences again, clearly embarrassed by his role in what had transpired. Maxwell confirmed he would be in touch soon about foundation paperwork. As the front door closed behind them, I found myself alone in the suddenly quiet house. I walked slowly to the living room and put on one of Thomas's favorite records, a Nat King Cole album we had danced to countless times over the years. As the music filled the room, I sank into his chair and finally allowed myself to cry, not just for Thomas's absence but for the family fractures that had been exposed today. The tears were cathartic, a release of tension I had been holding through weeks of calculated manipulation by my own children. But beneath the sadness was something unexpected, a sense of vindication and even pride. Thomas had trusted me to stand firm and I had done so. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the same strength. The house felt unnaturally quiet in the days following the will revelation. No surprise visits, no calls from Laura or Michael. The sudden absence of their pretended concern was almost a relief, though the silence carried its own weight of sadness. On the third day, I received a certified letter from Blackwell & Associates, an expensive law firm from downtown. The formal language informed me that Laura would be contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. The cold legal terminology couldn't mask the personal betrayal behind it. My daughter was effectively accusing me of manipulating her dying father, a man I had loved and respected for over 4 decades. I called Maxwell immediately, who assured me he had anticipated this move. Thomas knew Laura wouldn't accept the terms without a fight, he explained. That's precisely why we documented everything so thoroughly. The video testimony will be particularly compelling to the court. Will I need to testify? I asked, dreading the prospect of publicly defending my husband's decisions against our daughter's accusations. Most likely, Maxwell confirmed gently. But you'll be well prepared, and the truth is on your side. Thomas made his wishes exceptionally clear. While Laura launched her legal offensive, Michael maintained his silence for nearly 2 weeks. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he appeared on my doorstep looking tired and uncertain. "Can we talk, Mom?" he asked, his voice lacking the confident tone he had adopted recently. I invited him in and made coffee, the familiar ritual giving my hands something to do while my heart raced with nervous hope. We sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten countless meals growing up. "I'm sorry," he began awkwardly, "for what happened at the meeting. For how we've been acting since Dad got sick." I waited, giving him space to continue without interruption. "Laura's furious," he continued. "She's convinced herself that you manipulated Dad, that the will can't possibly represent what he really wanted." He stared into his coffee cup. "But I keep thinking about how he was at the end, how he talked about the business, about what it meant to him beyond just making money. Your father built something he was proud of," I said softly, "not because of its value on paper, but because of the lives it touched, the community it served." Michael nodded slowly. "The foundation idea? Was that really his?" "Entirely," I confirmed. "He worried that you and Laura had never understood the true value of what he created. He wanted to share it beyond the family, to make it part of something larger." "And the conditions for our additional shares? Working for the foundation." "He called it earning rather than just receiving," I explained. "He believed in work, Michael, in contributing something meaningful. He wanted that for both of you too." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Laura's lawyer thinks they can win. Says Dad was on heavy medication, that you had isolated him from us." The accusation still hurt, but I kept my voice steady. "The medical records and video testimony will show otherwise. Thomas made these decisions during a period when his mind was clear, months before the heavy pain medications began." "I don't want to fight you, Mom," Michael admitted. "But I'm not sure I want to work for this foundation either. It wasn't what I expected." "What did you expect, Michael?" I asked gently. He had the grace to look ashamed. "I guess I thought everything would just come to us. That we'd sell the business, split the money, and move on. And the 40 employees who helped build that business? The clients who trusted your father for decades." He didn't have an answer for that. Over the following weeks, the legal process began in earnest. I was deposed by Laura's attorney, a sharp-featured woman who tried repeatedly to suggest that Thomas had been mentally compromised or that I had prevented the children from spending time with him during his illness. Maxwell had prepared me well, and the medical records supported the timeline of Thomas's mental clarity when executing the new will. What Laura's legal team hadn't anticipated was the video testimony. When the judge ordered it played during a preliminary hearing, the courtroom fell silent as Thomas appeared on screen, thin but clear-headed, systematically explaining his decisions and the values behind them. "I've built my life on the belief that wealth brings responsibility," he said toward the end of the recording. "My greatest disappointment has been watching my children treat their inheritance as an entitlement rather than an opportunity to continue that principle. This will represent my final attempt to guide them toward the values that truly matter." The judge's preliminary ruling favored the validity of the newer will, though further proceedings would be necessary before final judgment. Laura left the courtroom without looking at me, but her lawyer's demeanor suggested they recognized the weakness of their position. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected visitor. Richard appeared alone at my door, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Dorothy," he began formally, "I'd like to speak with you if you have a moment." I invited him in with some hesitation, wondering if this was some strategy Laura had devised. "Laura doesn't know I'm here," he said, seeming to read my thoughts. "In fact, she'd be furious if she knew." We sat in the living room, the distance between us filled with awkward silence before he finally spoke. "I want you to know that I think Thomas made the right decision," he said, surprising me completely. "Laura won't admit it, but we're in financial trouble. Serious trouble. Credit card debt, a second mortgage she took out without telling me, loans from friends she thought an inheritance would cover." "I had no idea," I said truthfully. "Thomas worried about her spending, but not to that extent." Richard nodded grimly. "She's been counting on this inheritance to solve everything. That's why she's fighting so hard. But the thing is," he paused, looking genuinely troubled, "that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Using Thomas's life's work to bail out our bad decisions. Thomas wanted to help but not enable," I offered. "The foundation is a good idea," Richard continued. "I've been looking into similar programs. They make a real difference." He hesitated again. "I have an MBA I've never really used. Laura always wanted me in her father's investment firm, playing golf with clients and looking the part. But I actually studied nonprofit management initially." This was a side of Richard the First had never glimpsed before, a person separate from the polished image Laura had cultivated for their family. "Would you consider helping me talk to Laura?" he asked. "About dropping the lawsuit, about considering the foundation work? I think it could be good for her, for both of us really." I agreed, though with limited hope for success. Laura's pride and financial desperation were a powerful combination. Still, Richard's visit represented the first crack in the united front the children had presented. Despite the ongoing legal challenges, Maxwell advised me to proceed with establishing the foundation. Thomas wanted this to happen regardless of the children's participation, he reminded me. And demonstrating progress will strengthen our position with the court. Over the next few months, I found unexpected purpose in developing the foundation's framework. We focused on construction training for disadvantaged youth, particularly those aging out of foster care or recovering from substance abuse. Thomas had often lamented the declining interest in skilled trades among young people, and the foundation would address that gap while providing opportunities for those who needed them most. To my surprise, Michael began asking questions about the foundation's structure and goals. At first, I thought it was just information gathering for Laura's legal team, but gradually it became clear he had genuine interest. "Dad always said the proudest day was when he hired his first employee," Michael mentioned during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. "I never really understood why until now. It wasn't about having someone work for him. It was about creating opportunity for someone else." 3 months after the initial confrontation, the court dismissed Laura's challenge to the will. The judge's ruling was unambiguous. Thomas had been of sound mind, his intentions were clearly documented, and there was no evidence of undue influence. The new will would stand. Laura didn't call or visit after the ruling. According to Richard, she had retreated into bitter accusations against me, Thomas, and the legal system. But the financial reality was beginning to hit home as creditors called and luxury expenses became unsustainable. Michael, however, arrived at my door the day after the ruling with a surprising request. "I'd like to learn more about the foundation," he said. "Not just the structure, but what Dad really wanted it to accomplish. I think I'd like to be involved, regardless of the inheritance conditions." It was a small step, but in that moment, I felt a glimmer of what Thomas had hoped for. That our children might eventually understand the true legacy he wanted to leave behind. 1 year after Thomas's death, we held the official launch event for the Thomas and Dorothy Wilson Foundation at the community center downtown. The room was filled with familiar faces. Longtime employees from the construction company, community partners, and representatives from the local trade schools and recovery programs that would be working with our first class of trainees. I stood at the podium, still uncomfortable with public speaking, but determined to honor Thomas properly. Behind me was a large photo of Thomas at a construction site, arm around a young apprentice he had mentored years ago, both of them smiling with dirt-streaked faces. Thomas believed that a person's true wealth isn't measured by what they accumulate, but by what they build that lasts beyond them. I began. Not just buildings of concrete and steel, but opportunities that transform lives. This foundation represents his vision for a legacy that matters. As I spoke, I noticed Michael in the front row, attentive and engaged in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child discovering something new. Beside him was Jenny, his ex-wife, whom he had recently begun seeing again. Their renewed relationship had developed alongside Michael's growing involvement with the foundation, where he had surprised everyone, including himself, with his natural talent for program development. The foundation had already selected its first cohort of 20 trainees, young people who would receive construction skills training, life skills development, and guaranteed apprenticeships with partner companies. Michael had worked closely with the selection committee, showing genuine interest in each candidate's story. Laura was notably absent from the launch event. In the months following the court decision, she had maintained her distance, refusing most of my attempts at reconciliation. The financial realities had forced difficult changes in her life. The house in the expensive neighborhood had been sold, replaced by a more modest home. Richard had taken a position with an investment firm that specialized in sustainable development, a significant departure from the old money circles Laura had worked so hard to join. 6 months after the court ruling, I had attempted a family dinner at a neutral restaurant location. Michael came willingly, and Richard convinced Laura to attend, though she remained cold and formal throughout the evening. The conversation was stilted, focused on safe topics like weather and local news. It wasn't until dessert that I broached the subject of family memories. I found some old photos of the first house we renovated, I mentioned cautiously. Thomas was so proud of that little bungalow. We lived in half of it while fixing up the other half to sell. Laura stared at her untouched cheesecake, but Michael asked to see the photos I had brought. As he flipped through them, Richard leaned over with interest. "You actually did the work yourselves?" he asked, studying a photo of Thomas and me covered in paint. "Every bit of it," I confirmed. "We couldn't afford contractors. Thomas learned plumbing from library books, and I became quite good at refinishing wood floors." "I had no idea," Michael admitted. "I always thought Dad started with investors or family money. We started with a $1,000 loan from my father and more determination than sense," I replied. "The profit from that first house became the down payment for the second project, and then the third. It took 5 years before Thomas could hire his first employee." I pulled out Thomas's old business journal, showing them the careful accounting from those early days. Each entry represented hours of labor and careful planning. Laura finally looked up, her attention caught by the meticulously documented struggle that had preceded the success she had always taken for granted. "He kept every receipt," I explained. "Every invoice, every calculation. He wanted to remember where it all began, even after things got easier." For the first time since Thomas's death, I saw something soften in Laura's expression. Not forgiveness or acceptance yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The foundation's impact grew steadily over the following months. Our first class of trainees showed remarkable progress, their success stories featured in the local newspaper. Michael's involvement deepened, his natural business sense finding productive application in the nonprofit context. He began bringing innovative ideas to our board meetings, suggesting partnerships with sustainable building initiatives and veterans programs. The most unexpected development came 8 months after the foundation launch, when Laura attended her first graduation ceremony for our trainees. She arrived late and sat in the back, but she was there, watching as 20 young people received their completion certificates and apprenticeship placements. After the ceremony, she approached me somewhat stiffly. "The program seems well organized," she offered, the closest thing to a compliment she had given in over a year. "Would you like to meet some of the graduates?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite my pounding heart. To my surprise, she nodded. We walked together toward a young woman named Tasha, who had overcome homelessness and addiction to become one of our most promising carpentry students. As Tasha enthusiastically explained her apprenticeship plans to Laura, I noticed my daughter's practiced social smile gradually transform into something more genuine. Tasha's determination and gratitude were impossible to dismiss with cynicism. My dad never thought I'd amount to anything, Tasha confided. But Mr. Wilson, she gestured to Thomas's photo on the wall. He saw something in people. That's what everyone says. And now I get to prove my dad wrong. Later, as we walked to the parking lot, Laura spoke quietly. That girl reminds me of the stories Dad used to tell about his start. About proving people wrong. He would have liked her, I agreed. She has that same stubborn streak. 2 years after Thomas's death, we gathered at our home for Thanksgiving. Michael and Jenny, now remarried and expecting their first child, helped in the kitchen. Richard carved the turkey, having discovered unexpected culinary talents in their downsized lifestyle. Even Laura contributed, bringing a sweet potato casserole made from Thomas's mother's recipe that I had thought she had forgotten. As we sat around the table that had witnessed so many family meals, the empty chair at the head still ached with Thomas's absence. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The bitterness had begun to fade, replaced by tentative new connections. Laura had recently started volunteering with the Foundation's financial literacy program, teaching budgeting skills she had painfully learned through her own mistakes. Richard had developed a business course for trainees interested in eventually starting their own contracting companies. Their marriage, tested by financial reversals and painful growth, had found new footing in shared purpose, rather than shared acquisitions. Michael announced during dinner that he had accepted the position of full-time program director for the foundation, officially fulfilling the conditions Thomas had set for his additional inheritance, though he insisted that was no longer his motivation. "I've found something I'm actually good at," he explained. "Something that matters." As I looked around the table, I realized that Thomas's greatest gift had not been the financial provisions of his will, but the wisdom behind them. He had seen what our children needed more clearly than I had, and had found a way to guide them even in his absence. The foundation that bore our names was changing lives beyond our family, becoming known throughout the community as a place where second chances and hard work were equally valued. The Wilson name now stood for something beyond business success or personal wealth, just as Thomas had hoped. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and everyone had gone home, I sat in Thomas's favorite chair by the fireplace. The house that Laura had once been so eager to sell had become a gathering place again, its walls holding memories both painful and precious. "You were right," I whispered to Thomas's photo on the mantel. "About everything." The journey had been harder than either of us had imagined. The hurt had cut deeper, the healing had come more slowly. But the family that gathered today was stronger in important ways than the family that had sat by Thomas's hospital bed 2 years earlier. We had all learned, at different paces and through different paths, that true inheritance isn't measured in dollars but in values. That wealth brings responsibility. That giving creates more lasting satisfaction than taking. That family bonds must be built on something stronger than financial expectations to withstand life's inevitable storms. I had discovered strength I never knew I possessed, standing firm when it would have been easier to give in. Our children had found purpose beyond consumption and status, reconnecting with the values Thomas and I had somehow failed to instill in earlier years. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of peace that had seemed impossible during those dark days after the will revelation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them with hard-won wisdom and clearer perspective. So what did I learn from this painful journey? That sometimes the greatest act of love is standing firm rather than giving in. That it's never too late to course correct, to rebuild what's been damaged. That what we leave behind matters far less than who we help become. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision that seemed harsh but was actually the most loving choice in the long run? Or faced a situation where standing your ground was necessary despite the conflict it caused? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations.